I'm excited.
I'm not.
Deal with the word. Have you ever enjoyed running your talks yet? Let's expand.
This is the part where we run past the panel again.
Yes,
We're good?
yeah.
Wait, it's already out.
Yeah, came out like last week.
All right, welcome everybody. Those of you that are here in person, thank you. Those of you that are watching online, welcome. This is the first NicTalk of our new semester. Tonight we're focusing on pop culture in research and education, using pop culture in an academic setting, doing research on it, etc. I'm Nick Galante. I am the Information Literacy and Technical Services Librarian here at the Cressman Library. One of the moderators for tonight, and my co-moderator down at the end. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Nick Rivera. I'm the Public Services Librarian here, and I'm so glad Nick didn't include my job title in his name.
I'm messing up a couple times. And tonight we have three panelists here with us from the Cedar Crest faculty. So guys, you can introduce yourselves. Whoever wants to start.
Okay, so hi everybody, Michael Zalot. I teach in the business department, but occasionally also in the communications department and the honors department in the first year seminar. I use pop culture materials all the time in my work because my academic background for my doctorate was originally in media studies. After that, I got my MBA, and so learned some accounting on top of that, but this is why I'm here.
Cool. Hey everybody, I'm gonna address the live audience because I don't know how to do both. I feel like I'm traumatized from that when we had to do the hybrid formats a couple years ago. So hey everybody, thanks for coming. I'm Pete Nagy, as many of you know. I'm a professor of English, and I've been doing pop culture research, publications for, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so now. I was delightfully dragged into it by someone who's in the audience, Dr. Luann Fletcher, who challenged me to intellectualize one of my childhood passions, which was comic book superheroes. And I did that, and I haven't looked back. So delighted to be here to talk about what I can share with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Leon John. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer here at Cedar Crest College. I also am an adjunct instructor. I instruct communications classes. Last semester I did a media, a race and gender in the media class. I haven't done much research in the field of pop culture, but I can tell you I'm a huge consumer of pop culture. It is a big interest of mine, especially in the communications field. A lot of the work that I do, focuses on diversity. And so if you look at pop culture and how it's evolved, you would see that there's a lot of diversity among all of the properties that we are consuming today. And it has changed over the course of the last few decades to really reflect where we are as a community. So that's what interests me most about it, other than the fact that I just love to read comic books. I love to watch TV and watch movies, and I love Star Wars. I'll just put that out there. So thank you.
Not Star Trek?
Star Trek as well.
Okay, so it's Star Trek than Star Wars?
More Star Wars than Star Trek.
I go the other way.
You too.
How about you, Pete?
Yeah, Star Trek.
Live long and prosper, my friend. You're
It's all right,
outnumbered.
Leon. I'm more of a Star Wars guy. So.
All right,
Now
all
we're
right.
bouncing
2 to
around.
2. I love
Comes
it.
down to you, Nicole. You're the tiebreaker.
I mean, I'm partial to either, but Picard is so good.
We win.
Star Wars is redeeming itself now after the whole
Yes, it is.
one movie that we don't talk about.
It is.
Anyway.
As you can tell, we are all sort of masters of pop culture in
I
different
mean,
ways.
this is what happens when you put 5 nerds at a table and become a platform, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so I knew one of the reasons that this whole thing happened was actually based on the conversation that Nicole and I had with Leon, about a year ago now? Talking about when you get into pop culture research, when you start doing pop culture research, you find yourself going outside of what might be conventional academic avenues, conventional academic resources. So, based on your experiences, guys, like, would you have a good story behind, like, the weirdest research you've ever found yourself doing, the most unlikely source that you've had that might not necessarily fall into what we think of as, like, traditional academic authority?
Sure, I can start. So it's weird when you're picking up comic books and considering them resources for your research, but when you're doing scholarship on comic book superheroes, which I've done a few things on that subject, by and large your source material is comic books, so your archive is often your own comic book collection. So and whatever you can get from the official services online via digital, digital comics that are available. So it's very daunting because comic books in particular are it's a genre that's been around since if you can date it back to the beginnings of Superman, 1938. So you're talking about, I don't know, what's today? What's today's date? 20 years? 2023. So, I don't know, do the math there. So, many decades of accumulation of stories and storylines. So it can feel quite overwhelming. So you have to kind of quickly identify what it is that you want to think about, and then spend a vast amount of time searching through this expansive archive of cartoons, essentially. And it's weird because it's when you think of academic research, we're sitting next to library stacks, that's what you think of, right? You don't think of going into your closet, opening up a cardboard carton and pulling out singles of the Fantastic Four or Spider-Man or what have you. But that's part of it. In that context, for me, the one of the most rewarding finds I've had, and maybe unusual, is I had to figure out. So there's a particular comic I was looking at from the early 90s. It's called Doom Patrol. It's basically, I'll just say for purposes of abbreviation, it's DC's version of the X-Men, which is the more canonical superhero team. So I was looking at the 90s because it was written by a trans woman writer who had this very interesting queer aesthetic, and I was trying to explore that because to my knowledge, it had not been explored by any scholar before. And I had to figure out what the impact of that was on the audience in the 90s, and it's how do you gauge that, right? How do you figure out what impact this might have on a reader outside of speculation? And one really cool thing about comics is that, at least in the, I don't know if they still do it now, maybe they still do, maybe Leon, but they used to have these, in the back of comics, they would have these were fan responses to the comics, little blurbs where the fans would actually react to a previous issue of a comic in a series. And these were, curated by the editors. They always got the ones that made them feel good about their work and that really enshrined whatever comic it was that you put your hands on. So for me, I actually was able to find queer readers who had responded to those comics, and trans readers specifically trans readers who had responded to these trans comics in the 90s. So some of my research, like that interaction, was just like literally these little blurbs in the back of a comic book, but they were very suggestive and very telling for audience reception around the time that this particular comic was being published. So that was my little nugget of discovery.
We actually, that was the subject of a NicTalk, what was that, last year? We
Yeah.
did that?
Yeah.
I was
We
just
went
about
more
to
detail on
say.
that, yeah. So if anybody wants to see Pete talk more about that, we've got a whole video on it from
Yeah,
last year
it's
on that.
3 NicTalks back. 'Cause it
Yeah.
was- We had the Lauren talks after
That's
those.
true, yeah.
So if you're on our YouTube channel, there's still 2-hour videos, and then due to live, and they're saved all there. I will be working on playlists, that way they're in one spot.
Can I just comment on something that
Of
Peter
course,
said?
yeah, that's what the purpose of this is.
Yeah, so I find it very interesting that you were, I didn't know that about the fact that you looked at Doom Patrol and specifically the letters in the back. I think that's what you're talking about, right? Like when there used to be like, they would write the letter, they would show the letters in the back of fan reactions. So you were like collecting qualitative data at that point, right? I mean, you could basically say that because you were seeing the responses to the previous question or the previous issue of that comic. So that's really neat. I also like, you gotta love when you have academics talking about comic books because we're talking about it as research. I'd never thought of going into my closet and going into what is my basement and getting my stacks of comics and saying, but this is research, right? I'm keeping these for research purposes. So, for me, the evolution of the characters that we see today and how they're presented, not just in comics, but also in almost every aspect of media, is really what kind of interested me in teaching the class I did last semester, which was race and gender in the media, right? Anymore, and even back, comics have always been the gateway for stories to be told that probably would not be told in regular media, right? So whether it be TV, whether it be contemporary types of media and radio, etc. Comics was really that way of conveying stories that may not have had regular channels. And so it wasn't until I think 2008 when we had the 1-2 punch of the films The Dark Knight and Iron Man that people really, that comic books saw a resurgence in popularity, right? And all of a sudden comic book stores were a thing again, because prior to that, to my knowledge, comic book stores were on the down, right? There were a lot of places that were struggling to sell and move comics. I mean, we've had comic book movies in the past, but nothing that was as big, again, as The Dark Knight and Iron Man back to back. So for me, less of a research aspect, but more of an interest aspect. I've always been interested in pop culture, specifically sci-fi, specifically the superhero genre, but specifically in comics as well. That's do you want me to keep talking or wait?
No, you can keep talking. It actually fits up pretty well.
And I've worked in higher education my entire career at other institutions and now at Cedar Crest. And it wasn't until I got here and I got to meet Michael and Peter that I didn't get to talk to anybody who really utilized pop culture and research into pop culture that really helped me like explore my interest in these genres. So I'm still exploring that, so to speak. We have some great conversations. One of the very first conversations I had with Peter was about The Thing from the Fantastic Four, on what that represents in terms of comics and what that's represented since the 60s when The Thing was basically invented by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. So it's something that I'm realizing that has been around for decades, but we're just now really starting to see more and more people talk about this and explore it from a research perspective.
So for me, my discipline, my home discipline was communication and media studies specifically. So it's not outside the box to think about popular culture artifacts as something that tell us stories about our society and the kind of stories that we want to hear about ourselves and what we value and the experiences that we want to spend time with. And so when you think about a TV show or a movie or a song that you like, that's something that you choose to engage with, but that's also a social process, right? You take time out of your day to do that. I'm teaching media literacy now, came from it 9:30 this morning, and so getting people to think a little bit critically about that process and what it might say about who we are as a culture and what we want to think about and contemplate and spend time emotionally with is something that benefits everybody, right? So my first article that I would say was unusual for me, it was my first major publication in a regional journal, was about music and 9/11. So don't want to bring everybody down, but I was working in Florham Park, New Jersey, about half an hour from the city when the World Trade Center was attacked by the planes on September 11, 2001. After trying to figure out, is this going to continue for the rest of the day? What's happening to society right now? How many more planes are coming out of the sky? What else is going on? On the way home to see my family, almost immediately afterwards, turned on the radio. My daughter was 1, okay? So I've got a newborn, basically, a baby in this world, and the future is very uncertain. So turn on the radio, and there's no music. What's going on? Okay, so Q104 in New York City, classic rock. No classic rock to be had. People talking about current events. And I'm like, wait a minute, something's happening here that I kind of want to pay attention to. Flip the other stations through the dial. WDHA 105.5 in Northeast Jersey. No music. Talk. Let's talk about community space, about what's happening to our country, what's going on right now at this moment. And then I watched and I recorded, made a lot of notes carefully over the next week as music slowly started to filter its way back into the conversation because people didn't want to deal with things that they had enjoyed or felt emotionally in such a time of turmoil and uncertainty at that moment. And what you did see was almost an institutional response as the stations kind of reestablished their financial basis, which is capitalism playing ads for you, right? The ads came back, the music came back with sound bites embedded, and then gradually those faded out too until it became business as usual. This process took about a week and a half, and that's my first article. But it came out of a place of pain, a place of fear, a place of trauma, a place of living in a world with a 1-year-old where you don't know what's going to happen like the next day in terms of global geopolitical events impacting you directly. I was going to NYU at the time. I was in the city 2 weeks later and shaking as every building rumbled from the normal traffic that you get in New York City. On the 7th floor of a building is not a good place to be 2 weeks after 9/11, about 10 blocks from where it happened, right? But so I took that response and I put that into my first article, and they liked it. I talked to some DJs that I had heard on the radio as a kid. If you know the Philly area, MMR, big radio station down there, 93.3. The 50,000 watt flamethrower. Sorry, radio moment. But John DeBella had been a household name in the Philadelphia area, and I ended up talking to him for about an hour and a half. Unfortunately, I spelled his name wrong in the final transcript, but I blame that on the editor. So that didn't happen as far as the camera goes, right? So, but yeah, so being able to talk to these DJs and get their perspective of what was happening and how people were using pop culture to kind of heal and reestablish normalcy is the basis of that article. And so, did I expect that to be my first publication? Probably not, but it was the moment, and yeah, I responded academically to something that was happening to me that was personally concerning, terrifying, unsettling, disturbing. Got a lot of adjectives I can use.
Yeah.
Right.
What was the first song you heard? Do you remember that? Did you make that note?
Not the first song that I heard.
Sorry.
Would you hear one, Nicole?
No, that was my question too.
No, but I have a list because one of the things that had happened as a result of this was there was a policy that came out of Clear Channel Communications, which is a corporate owner of a lot of the broadcast stations, things you weren't supposed to play. And so things involving airplanes were on a banned list. So the DJs, some of them said that, yeah, we heard the list, we didn't want to pay any attention to it. So big old jet airliner by Steve Miller was right out, right? And things like that where people could be triggered by the images in the song and get additional trauma. And so Not that, but there's a song called Proud to Be an American by Lee Greenwood.
Yeah.
And that was the song that appeared on almost every list, including stations that you would think would never play that song in the first place. Like WYSP in Philly was still music at that point before they went to sports. Q103, classic rock. It's not a rock song, it's a country song. But people were looking for something that expressed that moment to them. And it tended to be edited and have the sound clips embedded, but that was content that they reached for that would be something that you might not have listened to if you're a rock fan. I know I hadn't.
Yeah, I do remember that being everywhere
Yeah.
when it happened.
Hey Nick, what's your weirdest research?
Yeah, mine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of got dragged into it, not in a dissimilar way from Pete. I was a grad student. I was actually studying popular literature at Trinity, and comic books were just not on my radar. Popular literature, I was thinking like, you know, bestsellers dating back to 200 years. But then all of a sudden I had a lecture on Arkham Asylum, and my professor was just like, hey, I'm doing a conference on Grant Morrison. You guys should submit something. And it just never occurred to me that I could do that. But as far as weirdest that I've looked into, that's a tough one. I should have thought of that before this because I knew we were going to talk about this. I just didn't expect to be put on the spot. I mean, I've looked at like Grant Morrison's notes from Arkham Asylum when I was writing that paper, like the original script and the things that he crossed out and edited and like little doodles that he did. I actually ended up referencing, you know, things that were so far removed from the final published thing. But yeah, I mean, that is what pop culture ends up being. Kind of, Pete, as you said, you take these things that we consume all the time and you use them as primary sources, basically. Like these are things that become they're the artifacts that you're studying, and you treat them with the gravity of something like, you know, Great Expectations or any other work of art or literature that you would talk about in a more conventional setting. And for some people, there is that disconnect, right? I think all of us, the first time we did it, we had that reaction of, wait, am I really allowed to do this? Is somebody going to stop me from doing this? And the answer is no, go ahead. You can talk about these things that we don't think of as academic in a very academic way.
I think that's the distinction is a false distinction between high culture and popular culture, because what becomes high culture over time may have started out as popular culture.
Yeah.
Shakespeare was for the masses, right? Shakespeare
Absolutely,
was for the working class, can I say that? Peasants, right? For the non-royalty, right? Opera was not high art when it started, right? So Verdi was for the masses. And so, you know, in 100 years, there may be things that we talk about now on a daily basis that are celebrated as high culture that didn't start out that way, right? So that's a process that I'm looking at a little bit in terms of what's canonization, right? What becomes elevated. And so that's something I've got on my back burner. I've got about, 50 or 80 unfinished articles in there on a daily basis, right? That's one of them.
Yeah.
I realize I don't have weird research. That is only because I am not a research content creator yet. Yet. We are working on it. But I am doing personal research in the aspect of Latin and Hispanic characters. So right now I am collecting a lot of Ghostwriter, Robbie Reyes, and a lot of Blue Beetle comics. That way I can educate myself more on those characters, as well as any others that I find along the way. So Miles Morales is a huge collection growing now too, especially since Miles Morales is Puerto Rican, so, which I am also Puerto Rican, so. A lot of personal research till I get the confidence enough to be on all of you's level to like teach it and write it.
You want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting you say that, right? Because you're doing that because it appeals to you, as a Latinx Hispanic woman, right? Or person. So, I was just jotting down some properties here that I was thinking of that really we're seeing much more representation in the media than we ever have before in terms of superheroes, in terms of popular properties that already existed and now we're seeing representation within them. And in terms of remakes that actually have representation in them that didn't exist before, right? So you think of characters that have been around, like, for example, Black Panther, Shang-Chi, Wonder Woman, all superheroes that were portrayed at one point or another, not specifically in live action, but we're seeing them become major properties now and almost household names because of the explosion of popular culture in our zeitgeist, right? You look at existing properties such as Star Wars and Star Trek. I know we joked about that earlier. Star Trek has always laid the foundation for inclusivity and diversity in its property in the 60s. When it was first released, I believe it featured the first biracial kiss on screen, right, between Captain Kirk and Uhura.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah,
One of the first, if not
it
the
was
first,
one
yeah.
of the first, right? But you look at that property now, and you have lots more representation in terms of not just race and ethnicity, but also members of the LGBTQ plus community, people with varying abilities that are actually main characters that would not have been featured or may have been featured in a lesser role had it been around, earlier. You look at something like Star Wars, right? We're joking around. There's so many different spin-offs of Star Wars. You're seeing, again, representation. The Little Mermaid, which was just released on Disney Plus, right? A property that has existed forever, popularized even more by Disney in the 80s, has a completely different look now. And look at some of the conversation that happened around that, both negative, and we tend to hear the negative, but a lot of positive too, and the representation that had for many children of color and little girls of color and little kids of color who saw and could relate to the character of Ariel. So I see this as, yes, there's a lot of research that exists, but there's so much more that I think we're going to see in the next few years as to the effects these characters, these properties will have on future creators. In the 90s, there was a company called Milestone Comics, which was eventually absorbed by DC. And Milestone prided themselves on having African American and Black superheroes that mirrored the popular superheroes of the day. Now, it was popular for a little bit, but then after a while, it just sputtered and closed down. Recently, since the advent of the 2008 boom, I call it, with Iron Man and The Dark Knight, and that becoming great for comic books as a medium, you've seen the republishing and reestablishment of Milestone Comics under the DC banner. So much so that they're becoming more included into the major superhero properties. Static Shock, which was a member of Milestone Comics, is now part of the DC family, right? I think Blue Beetle was Milestone in the past, maybe not.
Sure.
But yeah, so my point is that gone are the days where all superheroes, all characters, all heroes of properties look the same and we're getting representation. We still have a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of work to do, still a lot more representation, but we are definitely heading in the right direction.
Which kind of leads into one of the other topics that we were kicking around for this. With the advent of all of these, or even not new, but resurrected properties, or retooled, revamped pop culture properties, and even with new stuff, like as a researcher, as if you want to go in and talk about something like, say, Static Shock, or anything else that is very much new and emergent, what do you do when you start researching and you realize, oh, I'm the only one doing this? There's nobody else out there talking about this. There are no resources out there that discuss this thing that I want to do. How do you deal with that as an academic?
I call Pete.
It's funny you say that because I was going to say I call Nick.
I always view that as a good problem to have. Because if it's not, if no one else has, first, you have to be very careful and do your homework very carefully, right? Because odds are that there's somewhere in some corner of the universe someone has had a conversation about Static Shock, whether it's, it overlaps or beats you to the punch. is another question. But to me, that's always a good problem to have because then you get to just focus on your own thoughts with respect to the primary text. And but it's a research question, right? So you can go and our library people will know this better than most, right? You can start with a very specific search about static shock, but then if you don't find it or hit anything, you broaden and back up to something a bit more generalized to see if you get hits on superheroes and BIPOC, right? See if you get what? BIPOC, thanks, yeah. And see if you get any hits there, right? So you can just broaden and broaden until you find something that was within the domain of your research. But yeah, I was always excited. Like when I was doing the and the beautiful thing about comics, there's so many that you can find stuff that has not been talked about before. But I'm always excited when there's little research done about it because then you get to be the first person to do it. I don't find that to me, that's not an anxiety issue. That's an excitement, point of excitement. So.
Yeah, so Pete, you mentioned you've got this body of related works. But
Mhm.
you also, the other thing you have is an academic framework or an analytic framework. And so the question is, what's the tool that you're going to use to analyze the text? Maybe it's a social framework where you're looking at social impact, but maybe it's something like content analysis or narrative analysis. So you have the side of the theory, right, in addition to the content. You want to apply the theory to the content, and that creates your paper in some circumstances, right? So you have a variety of sources from the research methodology side that you can leverage, even if the content's not explored.
Better said than what I said. Thanks.
Which I think that question leads into the next thing we were playing, like the other thing we were playing around with, the idea of authority. So who do you decide is the main authority source that you use? Because with many comics, there tends to be multiple creators or illustrators or stories or plot lines. So who do you choose as the main one, and why? Or like in any pop culture that has multiple creators that have different versions of that.
Well, to me, the text itself is the artifact, right? You have the body of evidence in front of you, and whatever process was used to create it, right? We don't really care about authorial intention as much as we used to. We care more about reader response. And so, what is this thing that I have in front of me? What meanings can I bring to it? What analysis can I put to it? Regardless of what the creator intended, that context changes over time with any artwork or pop culture artifact or even high art. It's like, how do we see it now? How can I see it? What can I do with it?
That makes you the authority though, right? Because, I mean, it's all up to interpretation, right? Because, the creator, the artist, the storyteller may have one intention, but then you as the reader can look at that and bring and interpret it in a completely different way. Because there's so much nuance in any storytelling, right? Regardless if it's comics or TV shows, film, or books, whatever, poetry, whatever. There's always the intention may not land the way that the writer or the storyteller intended, and so as the consumer, you're the one that's taking the message that you're seeing in it. And so I think to your point, the artifacts are the text, are the properties, and so it's up to you as the authority to get the ideas out of there and seek out theories, to seek out, if there's any other research, and if there's not, then create that research, right? Yeah, I'll leave it as that. My mind's just like going now. It's great. Yeah.
Yes, it's kind of you guys just said like that. Maybe that's part of the fun of pop culture itself. Like we're talking about popular culture. It's the impact is what makes it popular culture. The fact that the public it resonates with the public and they respond to it. So maybe authorial intent is not important, or at least not as important as it might be in some other avenues of research, because you're focused on the popular aspect of it. How has the public responded to it? Or how do we individually respond to it?
So thinking about that, if I can just jump on that for a second too, right? So popular is a word that we can kind of pull apart a little bit, because some things are made for a mass audience but don't reach a mass audience. So I've actually been kicking around this idea of unpopular music lately. things that were produced at a commercial scale using professional studios with a professional budget, big names, just never went anywhere. But the fact is that that kind of a product was produced at that moment in time also says something about people who produced it, right? So if there is an album that has, you know, top-notch quality of production, you know, $100,000 budget in the studio back in the 80s, right? So released on CD. It's different in terms of the situation of cultural production than what we see now, right? So if you have your camera, you've got a microphone, you can get on YouTube, you can get on Twitter, TikTok. Sorry, you can't get on Twitter anymore. X, right? The dumpster fire, formerly known as Twitter. Right? How about that? You can get on there and post your content, but that's not the same level of gatekeeping that we had in like the 80s and 90s before the World Wide Web really took popularity. The internet was around at that point, but it was mostly dial-up and very painful to use. But and so in terms of what we produce, where we allocate our resources, kind of an economics question, right? So I don't feel bad wearing the business shirt today, right? But think about like our cultural production as separate from like whether or not it's a success, whether or not it actually becomes popular.
I think we have to define popular culture too based on our region, right? Because what's popular here may not be popular like 3 hours down the street, may not be popular 5 hours on when you hop on a plane and fly 5 hours away, right, to another country, right? So popular culture is very subjective, right? And as you're talking about music and all that, you know, we're talking about comics, but music as a form of media is just one of the most accessible forms of culture, right? I went to a music festival this past weekend, and it was a reggae slash pop slash reggaeton slash so many different forms of music. There were at least 15 bands. And there were so many different people there, like from different cultures, different age groups, different representations, different gender identities, etc. And it was just amazing to see everyone get together and what was popular to them. Like there was a band performing that I was there to see and loved that band. And then when that band left, there was another band that came on that didn't really interest me, but tons of people like flocked forward. Like it was like the changing of the guard, right? So when we think of what's popular to us may not be popular to other regions, other people. And so, you know, I think that affects research as well, because, you know, when we are, you know, I think we have to be careful when we talk about doing research in popular culture because it may not be as far reaching as we want it to be, right? I mean, it may be popular for just a specific market and not for everyone.
Or a generational cohort.
A generational. You said CD earlier, and I'm like, I wonder how many
What's that?
people out there knows what a CD is, right?
People in the audience. What's a CD?
What's a CD?
Quiz.
Or how many has CDs?
Which Michael pointed on that, I was gonna say, especially generations, which me and Nick talked about this from time to time, how some people don't know what the Wizard of Oz is.
I actually had that happen in a class, in a Writing 100 class, actually.
I had it happen to me with Avril Lavigne.
They don't know who Avril Lavigne is?
Yeah.
Feeling old yet?
Wasn't that like last week? That was like
Gets
2
worse.
weeks ago. What?
This was last semester in my Writing 100
Gosh.
class, and I was like, oh, I feel really old right now.
This was last year. I gave my Writing 100 students, we were doing evaluative writing, I gave them some negative film reviews of classic films. So they got to read horribly critical reviews of The Wizard of Oz, The Empire Strikes Back, and Jaws. And I had a couple of students who had never heard of any of those films. And so to the point of, yes, pop culture is subjective. Like some things that I thought were some of the most well-known films of all time. There are people who have even if they, and not a question of just they hadn't seen them, they had no concept of what these things were.
So I ran into that with gaming. So one of my articles from 2018 was about video game narrative, but I focused very specifically on what academics have defined as the classic era of early gaming. Right? So there's a set of years that you're able to use to kind of get away from that generational problem. But I specifically talk in the text about how this is relevant to my folks, the 50-year-olds, Generation X, right? And you know, I could name probably 5 video games out there that unless you were part of that generational cohort, you may have never heard of, right? I'm sure you know who Pac-Man is, Donkey Kong, Mr. Do, Ladybug, Moon Patrol, Spy Hunter, Galaga. You might know Galaga.
I know that.
Okay.
Right?
Spy Hunter,
But the
Ladybug.
more names that I list, right, things that would be familiar to people within a certain generational cohort, the less likely you are to get 100% accuracy rating unless you belong to that cohort. And so I think that has to be acknowledged. But in that article, I was able to define the class gauge of gaming 77 to 83 before the market crash because I had academics who had been before me previously had done that. And so I studied this era in particular for X, Y, and Z reasons, which I can talk about, but it was nice that I was able to define a time period that kind of got out of the generational problem, even though I had to acknowledge it.
That makes teaching turns teaching pop culture into an interesting problem, I think. I mean, it creates an interesting problem where it has to be a balance between what you're familiar with, and we tend to be as college professors older, right? And what the students will recognize as, popular. I think I got lucky with the comic book stuff because I so happened to do it right around like a resurgence and interest in comic books and the creation of the MCU and Disney Plus and all that. But I wonder like what if that hadn't happened, like how many students would be invested in such a class? Because I don't know, like how do I, if you ask me to teach pop culture in a different vein, like today's popular music, I'm like, I don't know. No idea.
It's not Avril Lavigne.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe it wouldn't be Avril Lavigne, yeah.
I think that comes back to canonization and what becomes historically important over time. So a little card here that Nora had made for us is got representation of Rocky on it, and we taught a class on Philadelphia last semester, and we had to watch Rocky. Why? If you're from Philly, you know, right? There's a statue outside the art museum that people come from miles away to photograph themselves with. The line on our field trip, we went to see it, was actually 10 people deep at all times during the field trip. You had to wait in line to see the statue, right? But anyway, so why is that movie important to history? Why is it important to the city of Philadelphia? What does it have to do with the American Bicentennial in 1976? Those are all questions we talked about in the film that anchor that in historical context and point to the fact that at least at one point it was considered to be important culturally. And so if you think about, does it have any legs? Does it have any tail? Does it have teeth, right? All those metaphors involving carnivores, right? So carnivore metaphors, right? My new band name. Anyway, so we think about, does it have longevity, right? Does it have a place in history, even if people don't talk about it anymore, right? Creed 3 came out last year. I'm still on Creed 2. I haven't gotten to that one yet. But
Michael.
I know.
Don't worry.
Well, Rocky 5 was very hard for me, right? So, like Star Trek 5 was also, right? The 5 seems to be the worst, except for Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy is probably one of their better albums. But anyway, so you get to the point where something has either a moment, you look back on it and say this was important at the time, and or this still has some relevance today. And so those are the kind of things that I think about, Pete, when I try to get beyond the moment of where we are. Yeah.
So a couple of things as y'all were talking, right?
You're gonna defend Star Trek 5, aren't you?
I am. I like Star Trek 5.
And Rocky.
And Rocky 5. I do. I have
No,
a
you don't.
a
No, you
soft
don't.
spot in my heart. No, you're right. I don't. But going back to The Wizard of Oz, Jaws, and Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
I guarantee they may not know the properties, but you start humming that Jaws theme song,
This is true, yeah.
right? You start humming or you say, Luke, I am your father. You start saying something about a yellow brick road. There may be these cultural pieces and nuggets that they may have picked up along the way because of pop culture,
Yeah.
right? And things that kind of embedded themselves in our culture. And they'll know that it's a reference to something, right? And I think that's what's so important with some of these pop cultural pieces is that they may not have longevity, right? Movies like Rocky, I actually showed Rocky in my class at another institution I teach at, my film class this week. And I would say 95% of the students had never seen it before. But knew the Rocky, they knew the Rocky statue, right? Which actually didn't come out to Rocky 1973 or whatever, but still knew the Rocky statue, didn't know what it stood for, right? And so, what I'm trying to say is that these nuggets of cultural aspects of these properties that kind of make its way into our zeitgeist, right? That makes it, I guess, pop culture. So I guess I'm answering my own question when I said earlier, where pop culture, is it really pop culture because it's popular to us but not to everybody else? But when the Nuggets makes its way into, because you could hum the Jaws theme song anywhere in the world, I can guarantee you at least one person would know what you're talking, at least know that theme song. May not know where it came from, but knows that theme.
Same with Jurassic Park.
I feel like especially in that example, like you have something that's been repeated and even parodied so many times.
Yep.
Yeah, South Park has an entire episode where Randy does most of the monologue from the bedroom scene to Adrian right before he fights Apollo.
Yes,
I didn't
yes.
do no bell. So yeah, it repeats itself, right, mimetically, right? And sometimes you'll see a meme that's based on an old movie or an old comic book where the source may even be lost to the modern audience. Like there's a Darth Vader meme that says it is acceptable, right? And so there's like some horrible thing that the poster wants to talk about, and they post in this picture of Darth Vader going, "It is acceptable," right, from an old comic book panel from Star Wars. And so the audience now might not know the original reference, but they use it in a new way. Same with the South Park references.
So I have a question, and this is mostly to the audience, right? So is everyone know who Leonardo DiCaprio is? Right. Have you ever seen the meme where he's pointing at the screen? Like he's sitting there pointing at the screen, right?
He's holding a martini or something.
Right, he's sipping. Do y'all know where that's from? I see a couple saying yes.
Oh, yeah,
You know where it's from?
Is that from the Titanic?
No.
No.
Wolf of Wall Street.
Jaden, what is it from?
From The Great Gatsby?
No.
He does have a scene in The Great Gatsby where he does.
He
have
does that,
though.
but that's specific.
So,
But that's what I'm trying to say is,
yeah.
right, that is like an example of something that has bedded itself into our popular culture, but we don't know where it's from. It's from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, directed by Quentin Tarantino, where he plays a washed up movie star that goes away and comes back, and he sees himself on TV. He's like, oh, there I am, right? And but we've used that as popular, like as a meme to like showcase like things that we're trying to say, right? So again, think pieces of, and that's probably going to be around for a long time, and people aren't going to know where it's from.
Yeah.
So that just shows that how popular culture has embedded itself into our daily lives. And so going back to research, I think it's cool to do like research on popular culture. When does it not become cool is when you see like so many sources and so many other people doing it, right? So, yeah.
But what about teaching, Leon? How do
Teaching
you
it is fun.
adapt, considering some students may not know the things you're showing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So like I said, I showed Rocky earlier this week, and the way how I related it to the lesson that we were talking about was movie filmmaking as a business, right? Because, you know, as with everything else, you know, you do something to make a profit. Rocky was made on a shoestring budget. It was written by Sylvester Stallone in 3 days. The caveat was that he would be the star, and he tried to sell it to so many different companies, and they were like, no, we're not going to make this. And then, finally, a company did, and it spawned off to make multiple sequels and billions of dollars, right?
And now spin-offs.
And spin-offs, and it all started with him writing it, and so the intent at the time was just for him to express himself through his art, right, and through this story, and a lot of people didn't know that. A lot of students didn't know that, and I said, okay, you know the Rocky statue, right? Because we do live in Pennsylvania. The Philadelphia Eagles just started playing. Like, we're going to see a lot of that Rocky statue in the next few months if we like the NFL, or we're going to like at least hear about it. If you go down to Philly, you are going to see it. So like, where did that come from? Let me talk to you about where it came from. And you ever hear the term, yo, Adrian, I did it? Have you ever heard this theme? Dun, 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 dun. Have you ever heard of Eye of the Tiger? Have you ever heard of training montages, right? Those are all things that came from, that was influenced by Rocky. It's like, let me show you where it all started. So to answer your question, it's going back to the source material or the manuscript and saying, okay, this is where it all started. Let me show you.
Yeah. When we watched it, we were in the context of the history of Philadelphia. And so that movie came out in 1976, which was the bicentennial celebration for the United States. But we were talking about the Centennial Exposition in 1876 and how they planned something even grander than filling Fairmount Park with all these buildings, some of which are still there. And really, the city didn't put together the same amount of effort that they did for the Centennial Exposition. So this was essentially Philly's bicentennial celebration. I mean, you see in the movie, you've got Apollo, and he's essentially Muhammad Ali,
Yep.
right, with the American flag
American
on.
flag, yeah.
And it's like a celebration of the city itself, but also the history of the country is kind of embedded in that as something that was read at the time as part of the importance of that film.
Interesting. See, I learned something today. That's great.
So Nicole, you said we're going to talk about Pokemon.
Yeah.
I'm out. I know nothing about
I
Pokemon.
meant that one as a joke, but it ties into connections that to be made from any sense of pop culture with academic aspects. So I gave the example, and me and Allison were playing around with it. Also, Nick, we did Allison an injustice. We did not introduce her.
Oh,
So.
we're terrible people. Go ahead.
We have Allison Edwards, one of our library ambassadors, actually behind the camera, sort of, because she's on the side. And she will be all of the audience online's voice. So, Allison, if you want to peek your head in front of the camera, you can, or your hand. So, but me and Allison were joking around while we were setting up this about how Pokemon can be connected to genetic coding, and we are a couple steps away from creating Mewtwo
Wait, what?
with cloning.
Tell me more.
Because you have the Eevee evolutions, you have the Pokemon evolutions, but Mewtwo wasn't actually a Pokemon that was created by like the higher being. Mewtwo was created by humans through cloning, genetic engineering, and all that. And me and Allison were talking about cloning and how it hasn't been successful yet.
That we know of.
That we know of, that's true. So we pointed out how that's a connection to science that people may not think of because of genetic engineering and genetic coding and evolution. And then Michael pointed out that his daughter actually learned how to read more solidified while playing Pokemon. So,
Yeah, so that's the story, right? That's a good story. So, you know, when you're a small child and you're learning how to spell, right, you have a lot of mistakes, transcriptions. My daughter was gifted a Pokemon DS with Leaf Green, the Bulbasaur edition, which apparently is collectible now. But you know, you get some of, Daddy, what's that word? Oh, that's Bulbasaur. And within like a couple of months, because she started to play the game, I noticed that her spelling like radically improved to the point where there was no errors because she was so used to reading as part of this new media product and something that we didn't have in the 70s, right? Handhelds were little bleepy dots. Clico football is all we had, right? Simon, beep, 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 right?
which is memorization. It
Yeah,
strengthens
it's true,
memory.
yeah.
But that goes into further with the question is how things like pop culture isn't seen as an educational tool in some cases. But it's also a double-edged sword because there are some cases where they accuse video games of violence
Yeah.
and all that.
So that's a big wormhole, and I don't know that we have enough time to go all the way through that argument.
So I have 2 minutes set until we answer questions from the audience.
Okay. So you guys want to take a stab at media and violence? No pun intended.
Or media in general, in society.
Yeah, so violence has always been part of our society from the very beginning, right? So, you know, it's just how it's portrayed in the media that I think a lot of people are having some issues with. But, you know, if you really look through where we've come from the very beginning of time, violence is just part of who we are, right? So when I hear about video games and violence, sorry, I think I pushed this. When I hear about video games and violence, my son was playing Call of Duty from the time he was 10 years old. There are settings on that game, right? So I made sure as a parent to adjust those settings, but he played it. And actually, the reason why I actually did not think it was okay for him to play it first, and I had a colleague at that time that was doing research on hand-eye mobility, right? and how you react and the time it takes to react for what you see. So he was saying that in some instances, games like Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, and some other games at the time that were popular that really made you have to think fast and react using a game controller was actually good for kids at specific ages, so it would help with their mobility, right? And so I was like, interesting. So then I looked into that, and I was like, wow, that's a good idea. So he's been playing Call of Duty. My kid's fine, right? He's 16 now. He's he's a really smart kid, really good school. He's in athletics, all of that. So I do think that the issue does not lie with the violence per se, but and this is my opinion. Is this being recorded?
Yeah.
Oh crap! All right. Well, I don't say it anyway. I just think it's laziness. I really, honestly do. And with all due respect for anybody who, may disagree with me, and that's fine. I do think it's laziness on the part of the person who thinks, or the people who think that violence is too prevalent in video games because they're not taking the time to learn how to adjust settings, and then also how to have conversations with the kids who are playing the games, say, this isn't real life, right? Limiting time, consuming, etc. So that's just my take on
There's
it.
ratings on them now. The ESRB
Ratings.
creates ratings like
Yep.
E for Everyone, T for Teen. Those came out of a really horrible Sega CD game called Night Trap,
Night Trap,
which
yep.
was featured full motion video in the
Yep.
worst possible way
Yep.
that you could ever imagine.
not
Not
even
a
a
very
good
good
game.
or amusing
No.
or even
It's
horrifying
not even a
game,
good
which was the
game.
intention. But it goes back much farther than that with the Blood and Mortal Kombat. It was like 1991. And then there was a game that came out in 1976 called Death Race 2000. In 1976 graphics, we're talking blocks, right, with other blocks slightly attached to them that move around. Your goal was simply to run over pedestrians in the time that you had allocated, and the game was two-player head-to-head. And so you put a quarter in, and vehicular homicide was the only way you could score points. So it's not a new problem, but it's a persistent one.
But you did touch on the benefits, which another one, going back to Pete wants to talk about Pokemon apparently. Pokemon Go had
That's being sarcastic.
Pokemon Go had such a difficult conversation because it got people outside to be more active and be all that. But there was also the aspect of people were crossing highways to try and to catch Pokemon. So
There's common sense, I think, that needs to be part of some of this, right? I mean, I think Pokemon Go came on at just the right time because that was like right around when the pandemic started to
No.
shut things down,
Oh,
right?
No, it was
years
before that.
Was it years before that?
yeah.
Everything just runs into
Oh.
each other.
The start of the pandemic, however, made it popular again.
Yeah,
Because
I-
everyone was stuck inside, but you had to maintain distance. So
Yeah.
people were still playing it to get out, but also maintain distance.
That was a wild time when that first came out.
Oh my God,
There's a
yeah.
meme that says it's the closest we've ever been to world peace in the first 2 weeks that Pokemon
I
Go
mean,
was
people
out.
were really helpful for tracking down,
But there's something to be
imaginary
said
monsters.
about that, right?
Yeah.
Like, as a society, we're all so like taken up with other people's opinions. The political landscape is just all over the place. It's this side or that side. But there's so many things that bring people together that you kind of overlook your differences. Like, again, that music festival I went to, that's an example. Sporting events, right? Brings people together like unlike anything I've ever seen. Media, like films, TV shows, poetry, books, just like those kinds of properties just bring people together.
And there tends to be fandoms upon fandoms.
Right? And it does produce some toxicity.
Yes, because of wanting to, one fandom being better than the other, which is why we had the conversation at the beginning about Star Trek versus
For Star Wars, yeah, but at the same time, there's just certain things that bring people together. I think if you capitalize on that, and that's why research is so important. I think because bringing it back to research, the more we talk about it, the more we make it part of our everyday lives, and let people know that this is not just something silly. Video games are not silly. Films, comics, they're not silly because they tell stories and people can relate to it. I think the more we make it prevalent, the more hopefully people can see the messaging within it, and learn to appreciate it more and hop on board with other people who didn't think they could share the same opinions with or same beliefs with.
Which I'm gonna throw one question in and then we'll open it to the audience because I just thought of it on the spot right now. Views on political based music. So whether it be Bob Marley songs, some of them were politically based on what was happening in society.
Absolutely.
Would we count those as possible research to have that conversation around society? Or just in general? Or expand the question how you want? Leon's ready.
So I feel like I'm talking a lot. So it's all cyclical, right? It's interesting you brought up Bob Marley. I wasn't even thinking Bob Marley until you brought it
I
up.
wasn't
I
thinking
mean,
music till we brought it up.
he was very relevant during the 70s in Jamaica and really started a movement with the people in Jamaica, right? To the point where the government tried to have him assassinated because of the impact he had on culture there and the people wanting to just be treated equitably, right? And be given access to resources. So you look at that political aspect of it where the singer actually has the intent of representing a group of people for their betterment. Then you have the other side, where you have singers who use the political landscape to benefit from creating division. But that's all part of the same, I would say it's part of the same genre, right? Recently, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot more of that, a lot of divisiveness. I'm thinking specifically about a recent artist who filmed a video at a location that was the site of hangings and public lynchings, right? Unbeknownst to that artist. Now, whether or not it's unknown to that artist, that's one thing. Acknowledging that he did that and he didn't necessarily have to issue an apology, but acknowledging that that is what happened, I think would have gone a lot better than just saying, we didn't know this happened, but we're going to keep the video out anyway. And people are just being too sensitive, right? But that made the song even more popular among his fan base. So I guess it depends on the intent. Was the intent to divide? Was the intent to stick to the art in its true form? I can't answer that. I could tell you from my opinion. But when you compare both like what Marley was trying to do and what this artist is trying to do, kind of like the same thing. That's in my opinion.
Another song that comes to mind is Black Eyed Peas, Where's the Love At?
Where's the love?
Should we open it to the room?
And the online room, if there is.
Virtual and physical.
Which can you see?
Yes, Glenn.
Thank you. I really enjoyed, the conversation that you had. In some ways, you're talking about the kinds of things that I talk in my class about a lot in terms of literature and canon and history and what's popular and what's not. And I guess there was kind of periodically throughout your talk, I wanted to say, but isn't that true of all literature? So I guess one of my questions is, and you did touch on this a little bit at one point, you said, how do we define popular culture? And I guess I would wonder, is there really such a thing as popular culture at all? Or isn't it just the cultural products, whether it's literature, music, or whatever, that happen to kind of surface, be created during just contemporary period of time? I mean, what makes something popular? Because as you pointed out, Shakespeare was pop culture back when. We just have, it now, of course, I mean, I could go on a whole thing about how now, like, oh, should we read Shakespeare? Oh no, because there's sex in Shakespeare, oh my gosh. But Shakespeare's been put up on that pedestal. You didn't even read American literature, Pete knows this. It was not until the 50s maybe, even
It's taught in the
Until-
academy, yeah.
American Lit entered college, curricula that you could actually read American literature. Before that, it was that popular stuff that wasn't good enough.
Mm.
So do you really think there is such a thing as pop culture?
Ooh, that's a good one.
So we're asking if there's a distinction between low culture and high culture? I mean, I think academically we're way past that. I think we've been. But I still think that people have suffered from that particular prejudice. I had a conversation with someone who was cutting my hair like 3 or 4 years ago where I was telling them about a course I teach on superheroes, and they're kind of like, ha, what is that? I'm like, oh, I teach it, at college. They're like, ha, what is that? It was kind of like, and I say this not as someone who's like hard, steadfast in defense of it. I say it with like, I feel like I come from that academic culture, being an English PhD, from an institution where we studied canonical literature more or less, right? And where there wasn't a lot of research being done, and not to my knowledge at least, in popular culture. There's that feeling of like, well, what the hell's that person doing? Thinking about, I don't know, what was the example? Pokemon or something, right? So like even now we're laughing like, Pokemon, like why? But I mean, in the proper context, with thinking about it with great sophistication, you can do some good research that includes Pokemon and make a case for its cultural importance. I don't believe in the distinction, but I do think that there is a sense that it is intellectually of less value and culturally less significant. Also because it's conflated with commercial culture, and there are those. Yeah, I mean those boundaries do blur. I mean, it's like I want to talk about like whatever new Star Wars series on Disney Plus, and yeah, you can make a really cool case for its importance. But then there's also the sense, well, you're just, peddling Disney's product for them as well. So it comes with these kind of like interesting like complications. I personally I don't think any of us who studies or really values, so-called low culture believes in that distinction anymore. But I do feel like that people do make that distinction, for better or worse. I'm not enough of a historian to understand like where the cultural hierarchy really comes from, what it's rooted in, and why it's so stubborn. But I do feel like it does persist in some aspects, right? A class on The Little Mermaid is not going to have the cachet of a class on, Shakespeare or Marlowe, whoever, right? And a class on Mark Twain is not going to have the cachet of a class on I don't know, some other fancy British writers. Go ahead and name one.
Charles Dickens.
There you go.
Novelist on his
Yeah.
time.
Actually-
Dickens, who was like the most, people were like,
Yeah.
waiting for his books like on the docks and stuff. Like he was a massively popular writer.
Is Vonnegut cool though? You support Vonnegut?
I don't know if he's made the way into like, but yeah. But
Actually, an interesting anecdote to add on to that, Pete. I remember reading, one of the first things I had to read when I was doing my grad work was an essay by a woman named Queenie Levis. Any other English people familiar with her? She's a modernist critic. Horrible, nasty woman from what I've read of her. Basically, she was one of many people that were decrying the rise in popular literature, like mass market literature, the mass printing of, mass availability of books in like the early part of the 20th century. And this essay was basically her decrying the death of culture, the death of literature. Everything was going to go now that the masses had access to books, and particularly books of little to no value. And in the midst of this essay, she goes on to list all of the contemporary writers that she knows for a fact are the cultural writers of the day, the great writers that are going to go down in history, that are going to be, Dickens and Shakespeare and Marlowe and whoever else was, already canonized at that point. And I vividly remember reading this list and not recognizing a single name on the list. Like these were all people that in like 1920 or whenever she was writing, she was like, these are the good ones. These are the ones that we're going to remember. And she proceeds to go on a rant about a bunch of popular writers that were never going to stand the test of time. And I'd heard of some of those guys.
Yeah.
She particularly goes after Edgar Rice Burroughs in that essay, which Edgar Rice Burroughs, for anybody who doesn't know, created Tarzan. So that distinction, why is there a distinction, as Luann said, is there such a thing as a distinction? Like, even the people who claim there is and claim to know what that difference is can't really predict what is going to become culture. I guess my point is, like, pop culture is just pop culture plus time is apparently what the takeaway is.
If I could build on that a little bit. So I wrote down books of little to no value. That's an amusing phrase that
That was her distinction, not mine.
that I may use later. But I mentioned before about unpopular culture, things that are designed to be in that space but may not succeed. I think that's something we need to think about, is a work designed for a mass audience, even if it never reaches a mass audience. But also, right, when we think about what does it mean to be a mass audience, let's go back to the first popular culture work, 1457, Mainz, Germany. Anybody know it? The Bible by Johann Gutenberg. And so mass media presents a democratizing of access to information, because the Bible in 1457 was printed in German. Previously, it had only been available only to the priests in Latin, right? So in terms of access to what is this thing that you actually get, right? The rise of the printing press in Europe helped create this idea of mass literacy and created this idea of access to information as being something that we value. And flash forward a couple hundred years, we add in this idea of novels or new stories, right? Original works. They weren't a thing until 18th century, 19th century?
Novels, 19th century.
19th
Well, really,
century.
like late 18th century.
Right, so I think Shelley and those guys, right? So those circles, Poe, right? And we start to get new stories that are created specifically for people to be entertained and to get some consumption. Some of those things we look back on and say, that was amazing, that was a most important moment in history, we should preserve this. And some of it, kind of falls off by the wayside. And that's kind of the filtering that time does, and either elevating something to canon or just letting it pass by. Remember Mary Shelley for Frankenstein, but I'm teaching a class on the apocalypse and dystopia in film and literature, and she's actually one of the earliest dystopian authors at a novel called The Last Man, which was a literary theme. And I'd not heard of this before I started making PowerPoint slides frantically 2 weeks before the semester started, right? But in this novel, which was not well received, so you get some ideas that we later kind of go with, but it's the ideas that's survived, even if that has fallen itself into obscurity, except for people who are studying apocalyptic and dystopian literature in particular. Bubonic plague wipes out most of humanity, right? So what's left? What do we do after that? That's kind of the genre of post-apocalyptic and or dystopian, depending on which way the society goes that arises afterwards. But that's not one that pops into your mind when you say Mary Shelley, right? Frankenstein, right? And so, the authors survive by other means, but that work had been lost almost until the 60s. I think they had recovered a version of it and said, hey, there's something that was here. It had been influential at its time, but it hadn't stayed the course over the distance, and people rediscovered it and they had to come back to it and say, hey, this is a moment that had happened. She was influential here. We need to put her back in the history stream where this had actually influenced other writers at the time. And so this is something that we need to remember, even if people had forgotten it in the meantime. So, I'm talking too much now.
No, that's fascinating.
Occupational hazard, sorry.
I have nothing to add to that. Yeah?
So you were talking about generational cohorts before. I'm just curious about your thoughts about now that media, all media is, not all of it, but we have this always available, the whole, it's kind of flattened out to the generations or so. I'm just curious about your thoughts on how that's changing culture.
So just real quick, and then maybe people have time to talk about it. So I'm teaching media literacy today, and I mentioned growing up in the 1970s that there were only 3 television channels. And if I walked into a room full of 50-year-olds and I said, how many of you know Knight Rider? That there wouldn't be a hand that was unraised, right? I walked in and I asked them, how many of you know Knight Rider? No hands raised. And so what you see in the meantime is cable, and then satellite, and then multiplication of cable channels. And now we have streaming and all these different streaming channels. I have 4 subscriptions, I was telling Nick. At any given time, we rotate them through. I don't even know what's on one of them, right? I can't tell you every single thing that's on Hulu, or every single thing that's on Paramount Plus. But back in the day, you had 3 choices, and if you missed it, it was over, it was done. People talked about it in school the next day.
Yep.
And you only really had 3 choices. Maybe there's some UHS stuff, but it really wasn't primetime focused. So who shot JR, right? Who's on the A-team, right? I can give you a list of things that people my age would have in common automatically, because even if you didn't know it, 1 out of 3 people you knew was talking about it at that time, and now it's much harder to find commonalities. So I was able to get Harry Potter. Everybody in the room knew Harry Potter, but it was kind of close. Somebody's like, I think so. And so that's where we are now. Yeah, I know.
Wait, I have a question to that.
Yeah.
When did you ask this Knight Rider question? Because
Tuesday.
I know Knight Rider.
Tuesday
Ooh, wow, now I'm feeling really old.
in COM 102. If Dr. Brancato is watching the broadcast. It was in your media literacy class.
It's also funny that you talked about streaming, because me and Leon were talking about that given lunch,
Yeah.
and how many there is.
I don't even know how many streaming services. I mean, it's one of those things where it's so easy to get access to, right? So to your point, you had 3 stations, so you just had to watch whatever was on, right?
103.
If you wanted to watch TV, you had one of 3 choices, right? And then there were the popular ones like Knight Rider, the A-Team, Dallas. Those were the popular shows of its day. But now I feel like there are so many options that you can watch something that people may not even know exists, right? And it can have a following that is really popular among that group of individuals. So answer your question about generational cohorts, it'll be very interesting to see how this discussion goes 20 years from now, right? Like, what is going to be defined as pop culture, and what are going to be some of the cultural aspects of properties that individuals are going to be able to relate to. So going back to what we're talking about, like the theme song of Jaws, the theme song of Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, like, Luke, I am your father. Like, we are familiar with that. But because of the access to so many different aspects of media, what's going to be those cultural norms 20 years from now? So that's pretty interesting.
Or even to go back to Luann's question, is there such a thing as popular culture anymore?
Yeah.
Right? It's more or less relatively popular than other culture, but can it truly reach a mass audience with so many channels fragmenting the audience into all these different interest groups and cohorts? It's great that you have access to things you might want to see that you might not have otherwise gotten produced, right? So there's a lot of variety and content that wasn't there in the 70s in terms of, they were always trying to reach the biggest audience possible, get as many people to watch the same thing as possible. You got homogenization of content aimed towards sometimes critically described as the lowest common denominator function, right? And now you have niche audiences for almost anything you want to put out. And so it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you have all these different kinds of content and shows that are out there now, and less commonality between the people watching them.
I think less, but there's still certain shows, for instance, that are popular among. So like, if we can call them popular because most people have seen them, I think they will reach a level of trendiness that a good mass of people have seen them. So if we said like, how many people have heard of or seen the series Stranger Things, the Netflix series? People will probably recognize what it is.
Yeah.
Or Game of Thrones on HBO, now called Max. I think if we cherry pick out some of the most trendy ones, I think there is a good chance that people have seen them. But yeah, it's become a bit more atomized, but I think in a good way because there are more voices, artistic voices out there, more writers.
There's a whole philosophical way you could go with that, though, because the 2 examples you made, right? Stranger Things, massively popular, a period piece. It's a period story that draws upon the influence of Stephen King novels, the stuff that made the 80s really cool, right? That really appealed to a whole generation of people that made it, I think, like popular, right? So there's that. What was the other one you used?
Game of Thrones.
Was that?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones based off a series of novels that were really controversial and made a splash when it debuted on HBO, 15 years ago, right? That has become like spun off into different properties, and it's almost like that Harry Potter thing where people kind of know it because of that, right? So it is interesting how these cultural norms are kind of shifting and what they're using in order to be part of popular culture.
Yeah, so Stranger Things also pulled on Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and
Yeah,
Dragons,
yeah.
right? D&D, yep.
Which
Part of
was
that revolution.
controversial at the time. I think they're playing the wrong edition for the year that they're in, honestly. I think it's the Beckme edition of the show. And it would have been BX, which was the Mold-Bay Cook, second version of Basic. Sorry. I'm a nerd, and now you
The
know.
original or the new one?
Any.
You've never played D&D?
Coming
Is
around
that
to
why you
tabletop
teach
gaming.
that?
Yeah, Luann has.
Which I run. I'm the advisor
Oh.
for it.
I have one comment to add to that. With the streaming aspect, the nice thing about it is we can now rewatch the things that we grew up on. So we have that remnants thing. So
Access.
I've rewatched One Tree Hill like 6 times. Same with like Gilmore Girls, things like that.
So that episode of Knight Rider I missed because I was like, hanging out with my grandparents at like a family function. I can watch that now. It's the one where
Many
Kid
times you've
jumps
watched.
over the cliff,
That's all.
which is every episode.
Just the one where
Let's also make
Archetype car
sure
comes back.
we're not
Oh, yeah.
confusing this with the remake. Because there was a remake
There were
of
remakes,
Night Rider.
two remakes. There were.
Team Knight Rider.
Team Knight
and then
Rider,
there was
and then
Knight Rider 2000, and then there was a series of movies.
Yep.
Sorry.
But
Nerding out here. Good.
No, I was just gonna say, if we wanna see if there are any questions
Luann
coming in
had a
from the stream.
question. Luann had a question.
Didn't wanna make sure we were neglecting them if anybody was trying to ask anything there.
But Luann had a question also.
Well, this is just, and this will probably be your last question, but I'm just thinking about the question of ephemerality. Because your ephemerality is the way in which, in the past, I mean, you were talking about books coming in and books coming out, and, maybe they weren't popular before, but they could be now. For all of your talk about streaming and streaming platforms, and you can watch all the old episodes of Knight Rider, that all depends upon whether a streaming service picks them up, continues them. The number of times that I get really frustrated because I was gonna watch that, but now it's dropped from Netflix and never to come back, and where is it, and is it gone? And so I'm just thinking about, and to kind of grow and, build on your question, it's not just a matter of the audience, but it's a matter of the access and technology. Over time, we are going to lose access to certain things. So the question of history and research, Pete, you had your comic books in your closet, but that's because they're tangible paper
Physical.
copies.
Mhm.
For a lot of what we're talking about, it's all going to go.
Yeah, and that's
I can
particularly
put
true
them
with
all on
gaming.
Peter.
Sorry.
You beat us, go ahead.
So a lot of gaming code has been lost over the years
Mhm.
for classic games because the copyright is still there, but the company has expired, and so there's nobody to maintain the code base. And even if there is a code base for it, with the platforms you play it on, may be lost. And so there's definitely a preservation movement in classic software gaming that seeks to address that problem. But yeah, 100%.
Something
Paul.
that's fighting that from the library side is actually this library called the Internet Archives. They are trying to maintain property and creation. So in response to your whole frustration of not being able to access something, that is how I feel about Constantine. Because Constantine was a show on either CBS or NBC, and it was really good, but it got canceled. No streaming platform has picked it up, but I can find it on the Internet Archives because the copyright was given up, and the Internet Archives picked it up and has the whole season on that. There's also the Creative Commons that once something falls off its I don't want to say fall off, completes its copyright period, it enters the Creative Commons or the public domain so that people can access. So Sherlock Holmes was the most recent one.
Yes, yeah, just this year.
Just this year to officially be released from its copyright holding.
Yep.
Wow.
So we are at 6 minutes.
90 years plus the life of the author seems like forever because it's the life of your grandchildren for things to enter public domain, but that's a different talk. So just kind of wrapping up with Luann's point, What I would say is when you own a physical media object, as long as you have the playback platform, your rights to that are, you don't have the right to redistribute or rebroadcast it, but you can play it whenever you want because the control mechanism is the device that you own and the content is in your hand, right? When you put that set of rights out into the streaming land, right, it's based on continuing the licensing for that platform that hosts it. I've had Amazon actually refund me money after I asked because they lost the license to actually sell me something that I owned.
Wow.
I bought it. What does that mean in a digital age? It means that you have access to it as long as Amazon says you do if you buy it through Amazon or whatever platform it is. So that's a great point.
I'm a big collector of physical media, especially film. I have a library of over like 500 films, including I have a VHS of the original Star Wars, and I have a VCR that works. And I say the original because it's been tinkered with so much that you can't even find that anywhere in its original format with the original special effects and everything.
You actually can. I don't know if you can get it anymore, but briefly, there was I think they call it a collector's edition DVD that has both.
Yeah.
I own those.
Yeah, I don't think you could get it anymore
I don't
because
think you can. Yeah.
because trust me, I've looked to see,
I
but
believe
even
you
but
have,
even the
but-
digital reproduction looks different than, but to your point, yes, the physical and maybe that's a generational thing. The physical media is something that once you keep that in good standing, it's something that won't go away. So.
Yeah. And that's a great point too, Leon, about how things get edited over time. There's all new model shots in the most recent editions of the Star Wars original trilogy. And if you go back to the Star Trek first series, I believe they've substituted out all those physical model shots too for CGI.
Digital.
And it doesn't feel the same, whether you say it's better or whether you say it is worse. It is not the original content. Han shot first.
It looks cool though.
The X-Wings going into the Death Star trench run are
That's
definitely
amazing,
an addition
yeah,
that helps
amazing,
with
yeah.
Episode 4, as the youngins call it. It was called Star Wars when I was 5.
Oh, Star Wars.
Which with the editing gets, like, for people that seen the original, the edits tend to be worse. So, like, I own the original version of Lilo and Stitch because I'm obsessed with Stitch. But if you watch it on Disney Plus, they changed one scene, which is where Lilo goes into the dryer. They changed it to be a side table with a pizza box. That's the door. Yes. And it's so weird because it's like, how does the pizza box stay up? 1. 2, I understand why they changed it because they didn't want children going into the dryer. But I'm also going back to Leon's thing about laziness. I hope the parents are watching their kids to not let them go into a dryer. 1. 2, that's a great height for a child because the dryer is kind of like
Yeah.
2 feet off to climb into that
It's true.
and have it moving while you're trying to climb in. I'm just thinking it's difficult. It's too difficult.
So what is real changes depend on who's showing it to you and what rights you have to access it.
Very true.
So there's some rare instances where the reissue is better. I'm thinking Blade Runner,
Yes.
right? Where the
Agreed.
director's cut is far
Director's cut,
superior
yes.
to the original theatrical version. But whether or not it's the same product, can't tell anymore because just like with modern games, right, there's DLC. The game that you buy is not the game that you may end up playing because it may be patched. There's additions to power levels, reductions in power levels. Unfortunately, I play League of Legends. I'm sorry. It's one of those toxic communities that we talk about. But every 2 or 3 weeks, there is a new list of stats that are changing in the game, right? So it's never the same game, and part of the appeal of the fan base is keeping up with it constantly, right? Whereas if you put your quarter in Pac-Man in 1982, it's always the exact same game. In fact, the monster movements are predetermined.
Yeah, it's
And to the
pattern
point,
based.
It's pattern-based, right? So it's always exactly the same game,
Wow.
like chess or checkers, right? It doesn't change over time, but I think that's something that we lose, and it's more ephemeral, right? How we conceive of what even a media product is now, right? At least in the gaming space and to some extent with movies.
Which another gaming space example would be the PS4 version of Spider-Man versus the PS5. Because they changed his face. Because they felt it wasn't realistic enough.
Okay.
But so many people preferred the PS4 version because it actually showed his age versus like the model version, that's the PS5 version.
Tom Holland. Right?
Yeah, Town Hall. But I think we're at time.
Basically, I mean, yeah,
Wow.
we're at 5:30. Any final thoughts, any last words that people want to have? No?
Thank you so much for being here. I thought-
Yeah,
thank
thanks
you for
guys,
having
this
us.
was,
Yeah,
this
it
was
was
awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you everybody who's here in person, thank you everybody who's watching online. We have more planned actually.
My
what's-
daughter made me, I'm sorry.
So
I'm a bad ADC, I'm so
our next NicTalk, which Michael might enjoy, is Monstrosities in Literature
Yes.
next month in
Let's-
October with Luann Fletcher and Carol Pullum.
Yes.
What's the date on that?
We haven't said. Yeah, we
No,
do
we
have
set a
it.
date, I just can't remember what it is offhand.
Is it
Luann, do you
Halloween
remember?
themed?
It's in the month of Halloween, but it is not in the week of Halloween.
Yeah, I think it's a week before.
Or yeah,
We'll be posting on our social media, it'll be all over campus. But yes, that
it's
is
the
our-
25th, if I remember correctly.
I'm intrigued.
So it's the 24th or 25th. It's one
Somewhere.
25th.
25th. Thank you,
25th.
Luann.
And the reason for that, I remember that, is because the 26th, we're having a Dungeons and Dragons night.
Yes, we are having an introduction night to Dungeons and Dragons for anybody who wants to get into the game, learn more about it.
The 26th.
Anybody who wants to spend 24 hours talking about your character's
Well,
costume?
But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And
Forgot
then if
to
you
do
want
it.
to check out
Dungeons
more
and Dragons.
articles, go to the library website or the Standard article, because I have that. And also happening tonight, because I said I would voice it, is it's real discussion from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that actually starts in 30 minutes in the Alumni Hall. So, bye everyone.
Thanks for coming, Luann.